Thank you, James. That's good. We are back in the book of Mark tonight, toward the end of chapter 8. So take a Bible, if you would, and we'll look there together. Geographically, Jesus is moving even further north with his disciples out into the countryside. Caesarea Philippi is north of Bethsaida. He left there. He did some work there and left. And then it's on north of the Sea of Galilee. Bethsaida's on the top of the Sea of Galilee. He went further north than that into predominantly Gentile territory. This is predominantly non-Jewish people here. The more I thought about Jesus' travels, it strikes me that other than maybe his family's initial trip to Egypt and back, and then maybe Jesus' trip to Mount Hermon, where the Transfiguration most likely took place, scholars think it was there, this is about as far as Jesus ever got away from home. And you have to understand, the whole nation of Israel is much smaller than you think. It's not quite as big as New Jersey, the state of New Jersey. So Jesus never really went all that far. I mean, he walked everywhere he went, and it took a long time. It's miles and miles, but he didn't really go, in our context, all that far. And yet, look at the difference he made in his world. You don't have to travel far to change the world. You just have to be willing to do what God asks you to do. Anyway, verse 27. Let's pick up there. Jesus and his disciples, as I just said, went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." This trip to Caesarea Philippi marked a major turning point in Jesus' work and ministry. So far, his theme, his goal, has been to help his disciples and anyone else who would understand who he was and what he was about. That has been his purpose. So his question to them there in verse 27 is truly a defining moment. Who do people say that I am? And then, who do you say I am? In typical Petrine fashion, Peter jumps in and he answers for the group, And though his answer was not complete as far as his understanding of Messiah went, still, Jesus finds it satisfactory enough to begin a new chapter, a new theme in his interactions with his disciples, which is to explain to his disciples the need for the Messiah to die. Now, in order to really grasp that concept, there are, it seems to me, two foundational ideas that the Jews of Jesus' day, including his own disciples, held that they would need to rethink, reconsider. The first we've talked about several times, and that is the way and the manner of God's kingdom, how God's kingdom is defined. And then the second, I want to suggest, because Jesus suggested here, is the value that we tend to place on preserving our own physical lives above all else. Let's talk kingdom definition first, okay? What did Peter really mean when he answered Jesus by saying, "You're the Messiah"? And related to that, why did Jesus not want it announced or broadcast, proclaimed? Why did Jesus then warn them, verse 30 there, not to tell anyone about him? Well, because if the Christ idea, if the Messiah idea, as the Jews thought of it, if that got out and got around, it would have been impossible for Jesus to complete his mission of preparing people to receive God's kingdom. In fact, this may well have been at least one of the reasons why Jesus went so far from Jerusalem, away from the Jewish leaders, and into this region far away, a place that's even known for its paganism. It may be one of the reasons Jesus went there, to bring up this whole topic, this whole question. I mean, picture it. It's probably on some road in an area that was just littered with shrines to the Syrian gods and to the worship of Caesar. That was fairly new in that time, that Caesar was a god to be worshipped. It was far away from the Jewish temple and all their traditional Hebrew trappings, and time-wise, this was months after, or this was after several months, many months, of the disciples watching Jesus do and say just remarkable things, That was the setting where Jesus pops this question that would define the months to come. So guys, he says, in light of all that you've seen and all that you see here today, look around you, look at me, consider all that you have seen. Who do you think I am? Who do you think I am? It's kind of like asking somebody to marry you. You've invested all this time, all this effort in developing this relationship, letting the person see who you are. But now all that observation and supposition comes down to a word, to a declaration, a commitment. At some point, somebody in every coupledom has to say, what are we doing here? Where are we going? Where are we going together? Who am I to you? Peter answers that question, Jesus. You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. Okay, well, that's all well and good. But what did that mean to Peter? Messiah. It's like asking somebody, how are you? And they say, fine. Okay, but what's that really mean? You won't really know how they are unless you know what they mean by fine. To more or less every, even marginally engaged Jew, Messiah meant, in a nutshell, the leader who would return the Jewish state to the prominence it had under King David. That's how they thought of Messiah. Messiah was the one who would crush all of the hostile powers that have set themselves up against Israel through the years. Messiah would restore and renew the city of Jerusalem. Messiah would bring the dispersed Jews back to their homeland, and then that homeland would become, in every important sense, the center of the world. And through that dominating power that Israel would have, world peace would be achieved. That is more or less what the Jews were expecting in Messiah. And that's what they, including Peter, thought Messiah involved. Their idea of Messiah was violent, it was nationalistic, it was destructive, and it was vengeful. They're going to pay. They're all going to pay. Now, it's true that it ends with the perfect, peaceful reign of God. That is very good. But it would all come about through a bath of bloodshed. So just think of Jesus and all that he did and all that he'd said about love and peace and forgiveness and all of that set against that backdrop. No wonder Jesus had to re-educate his disciples on what Messiah means, what God's kingdom would be like. And of course, it's no wonder that he was crucified. There's not much room for a cross and Jesus' idea of suffering, self-sacrificial love in the Jewish messianic expectation. So, with Peter's declaration, the re-education, the transformation of the disciples' concept of Messiah and God's kingdom, that's what would begin from this point on, and it would start with this stunning announcement that the Messiah would be rejected by his people and would have to die. Verse 31, Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed. Now, to say that was an unconventional way to think about Messiah is a tremendous understatement, okay? I mean, to preserve human life is the most important thing in the world, isn't it? And to preserve the life of the Messiah, what could be more important than that to a Jew? I mean, what good is a dead Messiah? That is absolutely what Peter thought, which is why he began to, verse 33 there says, rebuke Jesus. It's hard to even say those two words in that order, you know. Rebuke Jesus. It's tough to think about, to read right there in print. It's hard to imagine Peter or anyone else strongly correcting Jesus. So thoroughly was the preservation of our lives and of the Messiah's life especially, so thoroughly was that a part of Peter, he couldn't help but think that Jesus had to be wrong here. Had to be wrong here. There's no way Peter was going to let Jesus die. That was giving up the game before the game even started. But here's the thing. Even though human life is critically important to God, made in his image and all of that, the fact remains that God's purposes for our world are even more important. Which means there are causes, there are achievements and results that are even more important than earthly human life. Even more important than Jesus' own earthly life. There are things to be loved, there are things to be sought after, even more than our days of breath and heartbeat in this world. You catch this? And for Jesus, God's purpose meant providing the one and only way to eternal salvation for the world. That purpose, that accomplishment was worth Jesus' life. It was worth so much, in fact, that any opposition to it would be considered satanic in nature. That's why Jesus said what he says to Peter. Jesus did not believe that Peter was Satan. But the notion that even Jesus' life was worth more than God's purpose was absolutely of the evil one. That's how strongly Jesus understood this. It was placing, as Jesus said in verse 33 there, human concerns ahead of God's concerns. We're liable to do that from time to time, and maybe even more often than from time to time. We place what seems to us to be necessary and good. We place that above what God declares to be necessary and good. Even with our limited vision, even with our limited comprehension, we can't see around corners like God can. We can't see through walls like God can, but still we think we can see better than God can see. And so we place what we think is good above what God thinks is good. But here's the thing. To follow Jesus means to put even our lives here into God's eternal perspective, into his hands. Because the preservation of even our physical lives is not our ultimate purpose. The preservation of your and my physical life. That is not our ultimate purpose. Like Jesus says there in verse 34, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. If you've been following Jesus for any length of time at all, you know that verse. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. Now, of course, God is not out. I'm not saying God is out to destroy any of us. He's not. Destruction is not his purpose. But his purpose is always greater than just the preservation of our existence and our comfort here in this world. God's purpose for us is eternal in duration, which sometimes makes his purpose for people here on earth shorter than we would prefer. That's the reality of human existence. It certainly was for Jesus. And of course, no servant is above their master, right? And no student is above his or her teacher. If we are valuing our earthly survival above God's direction and purpose for us, can I say to you, we are not really following Jesus. How much does the eternal perspective of things change typical human presumptions? I mean, by and large, so much of humanity, and unfortunately, I think a big chunk of Christ's church, really does live like this is all there is. And so, of course, we think that to live and to keep on living, that is the greatest thing we can do. But really, it's not. The greatest thing we can do is to fulfill God's purpose for us. And as Jesus shows us, sometimes we have to give our earthly lives to accomplish that. Now, this is not a death wish, okay? You understand? This is not advocating that we play fast and loose with life, send our kids out in the freeway to play, none of that stuff. But the reality is, and those disciples needed to grasp this, God's purposes are sometimes very, very costly in human terms. God's purposes sometimes require that we give all we have to give. And Christ followers through the ages have done that. And gladly so. The list of martyrs is long. But they're not to be pitied. Those who deserve pity are those who pursue and preserve the wrong things, who give their days and years on earth for earthly rewards, whose life's chief purpose is to continue to breathe instead of finding and accomplishing God's will. To follow Jesus means to do as he did. And what he did was to accomplish God the Father's purpose for him, even if that meant a cross. And it did mean a cross. When we read Jesus saying here that we need to take up a cross and follow him, we tend to think he means some burden or some difficult situation or maybe even a sickness of some kind. That is our cross to bear. That's what we think. But Jesus' cross was a whole lot more than that. So who's to say ours will be less? The cross we're to take up is whatever cross that's required to achieve God's purpose. The reality is, it always costs us our life to follow Jesus. It always does. The benefits certainly outweigh, yeah. But it always costs us, if not our heartbeat, at least some dream that we may have had. Wherever we find life, however we define it, most preciously to us, that's what has to be turned over to God in order to follow Jesus, because that's exactly what Jesus did. That's a life that matters. That's a life that makes a real difference. Do you know the story of Telemachus? You ever heard of him? True story. He was a monk who lived in the late 4th century, the late 300s. And at first, his intention was to live a life, and he lived a lot of his life, squirreled away in a monastery, so he could give himself to loving and serving God there. He was a devout believer. But he put himself in this monastery for most of his life. But over time, he realized that to love God meant to give himself for whatever purpose God had for him. So he began praying about that, and sensing the Spirit's calling, he went to Rome, which was at that time a relatively newly declared Christian place, But he went to Rome, never been there before. He went to Rome as an old man. And there he found himself caught up in a parade that was going down. Some general won a battle somewhere. And he got caught into this parade, and it led all these people to the Colosseum. And it was filled. There was 80,000 people there waiting, no longer for Christians to be fed to the lions. They did away with that. But instead, they were waiting for the gladiatorial games, where men fought one another to the death, simply for the amusement and for the cheers of the crowd and the approval of Caesar. Telemachus, he's looking at this, and once he realized what was happening, he was appalled that men for whom Christ died were killing each other, while a so-called Christian society sat and watched and even cheered, And so right then and there, he felt he had to do something. And so he climbed over the barrier, and he ran out into the arena and put himself between these two hulking gladiators, He separated them, and he was crying out, "Stop! In the name of Christ, stop!" And at first, the crowd, they laughed at the contrast between this tiny monk, he was still dressed in his robes, and these huge gladiators. And the gladiators quickly pushed him aside. The crowd thought he was part of the show. And yet Telemachus kept on getting up and getting between these two men as they tried to fight. And so the crowd now began to get annoyed. And they began calling for his death, the death of Telemachus. And as they shouted and they began to throw stones at him, the manager of the games gave the nod or the look or whatever he gave. And one of the gladiators drew his sword and just slaughtered the old monk. And as he fell down dead, the initial cheers suddenly stopped, and the crowd got silent. Because somehow in that moment, a whole Colosseum of people realized that an innocent and a holy man had been killed for the cause of Christ. Somehow they saw the sin to which they had surrendered themselves, and they were cut to the heart. And Emperor Honorius issued an edict that very day, January 1st of the year 404, forbidding all future gladiatorial games. So here was, in Telemachus, as historian Edward Gibbon says, a man whose death was more useful to humanity than his life. To really follow Jesus, the disciples of Jesus' day, and we today, we have to learn that God has given us life to spend and not to keep. What would our world be like today if doctors and inventors and scientists had not been willing to risk experiments, often on their own bodies? What would our world be like today if soldiers in wartime and so many average people in the face of daily dangers not taken a risk to save someone else? What would our world be like if everyone would have stayed comfortably at home and never chose to be an explorer or a pioneer? What would our world be like if no woman ever chose to risk bearing a child? You see, the very essence of life is risking and spending it. Though it's certainly the way of weariness and exhaustion. As Barclay writes, it's far better to burn out than to rust out. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with the evil and the injustice in our world, and we might well wonder, well, what can one person ever do? What can we do as one person? Telemachus, from his eternal glory, would say, well, you could do quite a lot, actually. Quite a lot. And Jesus would agree. And while both would affirm the cost is steep, both would also say the cost was worth paying to accomplish God's purpose. How true are Jesus' words, whoever seeks to save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. The eternal perspective of human life, mine and yours, it makes our lives not the end, but the means to God's end. That's what human life is. May we pursue always and only God's good purposes and spend our lives making eternal differences. May that be the case, Lord, for all of us. May we rethink how we think, just as those disciples needed to rethink. May we rethink how we think about life, about purpose, about what is a good way to invest our days. And Lord, may we find that purpose in you always. In Jesus' name, amen.